Ja sam Boris Uden, ja sam uključen u taj projekt sa kolegama iz Poljske i kolegicama i Bukurešta, odnosno Mađarske, i imamo te studente, kao što ste čuli, odnosno sudionike tog našeg projekta iz središnje i istočne Evrope. To je razlog zašto smo na engleskom, međutim, kao što je Hana rekla, bit će mogućnost da diskutiramo na našem jeziku. Jučer smo imali predavanje Rastka Moćnika. Tema, inače, generalna tema ovog našeg projekta ovdje u Sarajevu je rat. Jučer smo imali Ratka Moćnika, danas imamo Ivu Vukušić. Iva Vukušić dolazi iz Utrehta, profesorica je na Univerzitetu u Utrehtu, na King's Collegeu je researcher, kako se to kaže, dakle istraživač, akademski je, dakle, jasno afilirana, situirana s te strane, ali inače nije u svom obrazovanju bila daleko od Sarajeva, sve skupa koliko 3 godine je provela u Sarajevu ovdje na školovanju i radila je zapravo, odmah da vam kažem, njena glavna tema je ono što se upravo rat, odnosno, kako se to kaže, genocide scholar. Dakle, pazite, postoji to naučenja genocid, ljudi koji proučavaju genocid, koji proučavaju rat, dakle, način na koji se rat vodi sa njenim posebnim fokusom na ono što se zovu paravojske. To je jedno novo iskustvo onoga što se kaže outsourcing violence, što znači da država delegira nasilje na privatne aktere. To je, kao što znate, bilo slučaj kod nas. U Hrvatskoj je počelo, u Bosni sam početak je izgledao kao da je to rat. Dakle, u Sloveniji imali ste državu, drugu državu i tako dalje. To se promijenilo, međutim, danas u Ukrajini svi ste čuli za Wagner. Jel? Šta je sad Wagner? Zašto Wagner? Otkuda to? Šta to znači za ne samo način na koji se rat vodi, nego pravno područje unutar kojeg se vodi rat. To je nešto novo i konkretni, dakle, naslov predavanja je, ja ću ga odmah prevesti, dakle, država koja, kako prevodimo outsourcing? Teško je, dakle, ja sam to rekao, delegira na druge aktere izvan sebe. Država, dakle, nasilje, državno delegirano nasilje, dakle, paravojske u bivšoj Jugoslaviji i Ukrajini. Iva, izvoli.
Hvala lijepa, Boris. Hvala svima vama. Dobro večer. Ja ću prvih nekoliko minuta pričati na našem jeziku i onda ću se prebaciti na engleski. Hvala puno organizatorima na pozivu i hvala vama što ste došli. Meni je velika čast i zadovoljstvo da sam u Sarajevu i da govorim o temi na kojoj sam radila svoj doktorat, kojem se bavim već dugi niz godina. Ja sam, kao što je Boris rekao, živjela ovdje na Malti između 2006. i 2009. Bila sam studentica na masteru, nažalost, pokojnog profesora Grebe na CIPS-u i radila sam kao analitičarka u Tužilaštvu za ratne zločine Bosne i Hercegovine. I tamo sam provela, znači, 2 godine nakon mastera. Radila sam neko vrijeme i u istraživačko-dokumentacionom centru kod Mirsada Tokače, tako da prije 15 godina sam tu boravila i velik dio mog profesionalnog života je obilježen mojim boravkom ovdje i mog privatnog života, tako da mi je baš silno zadovoljstvo i jako mi je drago da sam tu večera s vama. Ja ću govoriti otprilike negdje 45 minuta i onda nakon toga će biti prostora za pitanja i komentare. Ovdje imam malu ceduljicu na kojoj piše govori sporije, zato što je moja prirodna tendencija da govorim brzo, tako da unaprijed se ispričavam dragim prevoditeljicama koje će se možda malo sa mnom mučiti, ali evo zaista se trudim. Znači, naslov predavanja Paravojska u bivšoj Jugoslaviji i Ukrajini, tako da je ovo vjerovatno sad dobar trenutak da se prebacim na engleski. Yes. All right. So I'm switching to English now. So as we were already discussing, this is going to be the topic of this evening. I'm going to try to trace some important topics and raise important questions about paramilitaries in the former Yugoslavia and Ukraine. And we're going to be talking about something that Boris already alluded to, which is violence as it is perpetrated in the name of the state. When I am asked what I do, what my research is about, I often start my lectures and my talks with this image. Now, for many of you that are from Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is going to be a very well-known image. This is the beginning of the war. It's in Bijeljina in the spring of 1992, where we could say much started for Bosnia and Herzegovina. For those of you that are not from here, it is likely that if you know something about the war in the former Yugoslavia and a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you would have seen this image. The man casually hitting the person on the floor is Srđan Golubović, a member of the Orkan's Tigers, and the woman lying on the floor that he is kicking, her name is Tifa Šabanović, and these were people that were killed and victimized in the first days of the war. What I think is really notable about this picture is the casualness with which Golubović is perpetrating the violence, with the glasses kind of perked on his head, with a cigarette, just very casually doing what he is doing. There is another image that I think, to me, often comes up, and this is a couple of months before Vukovar in 1991, after the fall of the city. And also, I think, a picture that some of you may have seen by the same photographer, by Ron Haviv. So basically, the plan for tonight will be that I will start off by saying a couple of words about what, according to me, are paramilitaries, what are some of their characteristics, what are their relationships with the state, and what kind of violence do they perpetrate. I will be talking about some concrete examples from Bosnia and Herzegovina and from Ukraine. I will raise some questions and make some points about the discussion, the broader discussion on accountability, and holding individuals criminally accountable for paramilitary attacks on civilians. And I should also say that this talk is based on my book, my first book, and if you later want to ask me why I focus on Serbian units, as often people do, I will happily explain. So a couple of just note on practicalities before we get into it. If I use an acronym that is unknown to you and you need a question of clarification, feel free to just interrupt me. I really don't mind. If it's a more substantive question, something that requires a bit more of discussion, I suggest that you wait for the Q&A. While we will be discussing violence and attacks on civilians, as well as accountability, I will refrain, so I will not be showing any more images that are particularly violent. And again, if you have a question about why that is my practice, I am more than happy to engage in that discussion also in the Q&A. So my perspective is one of a historian and a person that has spent a good part of my life in legal circles. I'm not a lawyer, but I've spent a good amount of time working both here at the Special War Crimes Department and then in The Hague. I also worked with, also sadly recently late, Mirko Klarin, who used to run the Sense News Agency. So that is sort of the baggage that I come to this story with. I am fully aware that anthropologists, ethnographers, philosophers, and people from other disciplines would approach this topic differently. And as we already just briefly touched on, I study perpetrators, so people who perpetrate violence, and here I'm particularly focused on violence against civilians. I look at action, so how perpetration is conducted, and accountability efforts that follow or don't. So war crimes trials. This has been my professional life, as I said, for almost 20 years. My interest kind of started with the Milošević trial, and we are about 20 years since then. It's hard to believe, but that really is the case. So, what is a paramilitary? Paramilitaries are very common in contemporary warfare. They're frequent perpetrators of violence. They're commonly understood to be spoilers of various peace agreements. Data from the last couple of years from the United Nations, from the Red Cross, puts the number of various kinds of irregular armed units or paramilitaries to, thousands and thousands. I remember one report that came out of the UN. I think this was 2011 in the city of Misrata in Libya. There were several hundreds of various units that were active there. So this is really, I would say, a characteristic of contemporary warfare that in general, and this is a little bit different, I would say, in Ukraine right now, but in general, much warfare these days is not conducted between militaries. It is much more common that these kinds of actors are the ones that are involved in warfare. There are numerous definitions, and many scholars disagree depending on the context that they study. What are these units? People use overlapping terms: paramilitary, irregular armed groups, non-state actors, pro-government militias, mercenaries. So there's a lot of these terms that are used, but tonight I will be focusing on what we would call pro-government units. What I think is also important to say at the very beginning is that they are very diverse actors, and they have really dynamic relationships with the state. So units, and we will see this hopefully in my talk tonight, are really dynamic actors. So it's hard to describe units, what are they doing in a period of 5 or 10 years' time, because it's a really fast moving space. What I think is also really important is that, and this is something that other scholars have pointed out as well, is that this idea of outsourcing violence and plausible deniability is key in this story. There's a certain ambiguity about who these units, quote unquote, belong to. And that plays out in courtrooms, in war crimes trials, in ways that we can discuss in more detail in the Q&A. But this idea of outsourcing violence is really a key here, and I'll get into it in a moment. Structures and purposes of units are also different, and when it comes to perpetration of violence, they also attack civilians differently. In much of the literature on the former Yugoslavia, and this literature is really very, very vast, as I'm sure many of you know, it is often the case that paramilitary units are treated in bulk, sort of all together. And then paramilitaries did this, and then paramilitaries did that. Much of my research has shown actually that there's a lot of difference between them, and there's a lot of difference in also how they attack civilians. So how do I know what I know? And what is the basis of my book? So I bet every single person in the former Yugoslavia knows what this building is. So this is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The ICTY is the acronym that I'm going to use. I spent 6 years here physically every day, and I watched most of the trials pretty much. I watched Karadzic pretty much every day. I watched Mladic every day. I was there really for, much of the war crimes trials that basically took place since 2009. I was recently at the Stanisic and Simatovic appeals arguments as well. So the documents that I use in my book and more generally in my research are archives from this institution. What I think is important to say is that almost 5,000 witnesses testified there. There is millions and millions and billions of pages of documents from the variety of trials that took place since the tribunal was established basically in 1993. And much of this archival resource is actually available online. This is not the case for other courts. I live in The Hague, so the International Criminal Court, for example, does not allow access to its transcripts or its evidence material. So I think we can criticize the ICTY for 1,000 reasons, but I think if we have to give it one compliment, this compliment is that it makes a lot of this material available to basically anyone with an email address. And we can get into sort of how we study this material later if you're interested. So what is a paramilitary? As I said already, it depends a little bit on context and the discipline that the scholars come from. One thing that I would really suggest reading is the book by a colleague of mine, He's a professor at the University of Amsterdam. His name is Ugur Ungor, and he wrote a really good book with Oxford University Press about paramilitarism. But what I took from the research that I've done is that for me, there are 5 key features that make a paramilitary. One is that it is an armed group. Pretty obvious, right? The second is that it is organized, so it has some kind of leadership and structure. Third is that it is recognizable, so it has a name or a patch on the shoulder or some kind of insignia that would make it recognizable to others. Fourth is that it has a certain political purpose, even if this political purpose is not necessarily publicly stated. And fifth, and I think this is really crucial, is that the unit at the time of establishment does not form part of the formal police or military structures. I say at the time of establishment because for many units later in time, this status changes. They get incorporated, sucked into the state. So to say, and this is an ideal type. So of course, in reality, the messy reality often doesn't fit our neat categories. So I would say this is also the one such case where some of these units sort of inhabit gray spaces at various points in time. So on the diverse and dynamic relationships between the state and the units. So of course, they're often secret. They're secretly funded, trained, operated, and deployed. And they can act within the country and abroad. There's certain units, and this was very much the case in the former Yugoslavia, that are closer to the state. For example, they collaborate with or sort of fall within informally the Ministry of Internal Affairs or the Department of Defense, or they are more distant. And this is sometimes, for example, the case with units that are established or mobilized through political parties, but with sort of the blessing of the state. They tend to be paid for secretly, sometimes also from illegal activities like smuggling, drug trade, car theft, car sales, and sanctions busting, which was also very much the case in the former Yugoslavia. They, of course, are often linked to organized crime and involve these sort of middlemen that bring together the state structures, often state security, organized crime, and the armed guys, such as, for example, Srđan Bush that we've seen at the beginning. The loyalty and the level of independence of these units change through time, and these are very much sort of transactional relationships. Now on this point of outsourcing violence and plausible deniability. So what do I mean by plausible deniability? So this is basically this practice of outsourcing violence from the states to the units which are seemingly independent. And this word seemingly, I think, is really crucial. So the state kind of delegates the word that Boris used, certain actions to units, by which the state can distance itself from the violence and pretend that it has nothing to do with it. So the purpose is to shield the state from the consequences of such illegal, illegitimate actions. And this is actually one of the main reasons why states use paramilitaries, and the former Yugoslavia very much is not the only case where we see such units. So in practice, how does plausible deniability work? So for example, it works by removing insignia from, so the patches off the shoulders when units move into action. All of these come from either documents that we've seen in ICTY trials or statements by former members. We saw a lot of them testify in The Hague, so this is, it's nothing revolutionary to anyone who has watched the trials. They spoke of members being hired like freelancers, like consultants on contract and kind of paid off the books. They were swearing certain units especially, such as the Red Berets, and we'll talk about them in a moment. They were swearing members to secrecy, so you were not supposed to go around easily talking about what you were doing. They don't exist in any official budgets. What I found was really fascinating. There were hiring practices by which 60% of the members in certain units had to be from outside Serbia proper, so that if anyone was to be analyzing these units, they would say the majority of the members are not from Serbia proper. So these very kind of, smart ways of trying to make sure that these connections between the state and the units are not easily made. So the idea is to hide links between the states and the units, and to avoid diplomatic consequences, additional sanctions, and criminal prosecution for the state officials. And an important point, and I think anyone who has watched the ICTY in the last 20 years or more, or now the mechanism is basically this institution that is like a daughter institution to the tribunal that has closed in 2017. Plausible deniability works. It works in court, and that's why states continue to use it. And we can talk about concrete examples later if you're interested. So, if you want to seize territory across an international border and you don't want to go to jail for it, a good way to do it is to hire these kinds of guys. So just a couple of words about the mobilization, the joining the units. So members were volunteers, so these are not guys that are drafted, and they tend to be male. I have pored over thousands and thousands of documents. I have never seen an active female member of any relevance. So this is, in the former Yugoslavia, an extremely male world. Women were in that space. For example, one important witness at the ICTY was a secretary that worked in Arkan's office, but they were not kind of armed members deploying in the field. Not uncommon practice for states is to offer reductions in prison sentences to people who join, and we very much see that with Wagner as well right now. And we'll get to it in a moment. Members often join through kinship ties. So people join units because their brother was already in it, or their cousin was in it, or their neighbor was in it, or someone from their class. So these kinds of connections tend to move through these sort of kinship ties. What I think is also really notable is that the recruitment is often kind of the human resources pool for paramilitaries is often sports clubs, football fan clubs, and martial arts clubs. And my argument is that one of the reasons why that is the case is because if you need guys to deploy violently, then you want to use guys who are already accustomed to using their bodies for violence. So you want someone who is okay with smashing someone's head already, so that this is not something that they do for the first time, maybe in the context of war. I often get questions about ideology and kind of how, what is the role of ideology and all of that. My sense is that it is an important factor because it really shapes the atmosphere in which these guys exist. It shapes the opinions of their social connections. But I don't think ideology is what makes you harm another human being. It may bring you to a certain point to join a unit, but it won't make you take a baseball bat to someone's head. Sometimes I think also my reading of some of the statements is that a driving force to join units were economic ambitions. A lot of these guys saw participation in these kinds of units as their way to social mobility. These are not necessarily guys who have a lot of other really good stuff going on in their lives in terms of their future. And I think recruiters know that. So they go to certain places to target such young men. If there is one piece of archival material that I found that I absolutely consider archival gold, it's this. And I shall say this in Croatian, Pička puška država. So this is the creed of the Scorpions commander. This is what he said in his trial in Belgrade. He said this: I loved three things in life, and I'm going to share them with all of you. I loved, and I'm going to be vulgar here because that is the kind of man that I am, I love pussy, the rifle, and the state. And I still stand by that. That has to be clear to all. If I had my way, Pička puška država would be the title of the book once it is translated in our language. I don't think it's going to work because I think this is such a good summary of a lot of what these guys were like. So, structures and purposes of different kinds of units. I won't get into a lot of detail here. I talk about it extensively in my book, but one important distinction, I think, is that some units were more professionalized and some units were less professionalized. And here, where I talk about professionalism, I mean capacity, the capacity to harm. I don't mean any moral code or anything like that. I mean that, can this guy climb a rope? Can this guy run fast with a heavy backpack? This is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And certain differences existed in age, in physical, the physical fitness, the levels of alcohol that some of these guys consumed. So there were really stark differences between Red Berets and, for example, the Sheshedevci, the guys that were organized and mobilized through radical political party sort of circles. I would also say some units were more centralized, more hierarchical, sort of pyramid-like structure, and some others were more sort of diffuse. So there are really differences between these units, and if you have more questions about that, we can go into that later. Some are also much more obviously ideologically driven than others. As I already said, the ideology may drive you to kind of push you a little bit along to join a unit, but it won't make you harm others. Some units were also very mobile, so they moved from place to place. There is a quote in my book that I use: they come to town, they shoot you in the head, and they move on. While others tended to be moored in certain places where they often hurt people that they knew, which influences how they hurt people. It's just a different dynamic if you are acting violently in a place where you know the people around you, that you know them from school or you know them from some other social setting. Some units were more active on the front lines and some were not. So again, the way that they deployed was also very different. Some were engaged much more in sort of persecuting and conducting what we would call ethnic cleansing than others. What I think is also really important to understand from my perspective, I often get questions like, was it this that made them hurt people? I don't think there's any one thing that makes you commit a war crime or perpetrate violence against innocent people. There's not one thing that can explain it. No one thing drives perpetrators, and people that are familiar, for example, with literature that relates to perpetration in relation to the Holocaust know about this eternal debate that was a little bit about, is it the situation or is it the disposition of the person, and sort of how these things interact. So this is one image of the so-called Red Berets in what we call it the ICTY BCS, Bosnian Serbian Croatian. It's the JSO, Jedinica za specijalne operacije. These were, I would say, people called in the Praetorian Guard. This is like the elite unit that many trials in the ICTY dealt with, more or less. But more than any other trial, the Stanisic and Simatovic case was about this unit. So they are, I think, an example of kind of a more professionalized, more centralized unit with younger guys that can like climb a rope and run fast. These are some of the people. I'm sure many of you will recognize these faces. On the left, Dragan Vasitković, Captain Dragan, he was involved a bit like a consultant in the early days of the training in Golubić next to Knin in Croatia. He recently, a couple of years ago, he finalized his sentence. He was serving a sentence in Croatia after a very, very long legal battle. And between is Franki Simatović. He is miraculously somehow still on trial. It's been 20 years since that the first trial began, but the entire legal saga is now entering its final stage. He was an official in the Serbian Ministry of Internal Affairs, and with Jovica Stanisic, he is waiting for the appeals judgment in his second trial in The Hague, basically for establishing, running, financing, and operating these kinds of units in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the one guy on the right is Milorad Bulemek Legija, serving, I think, several lifelong sentences in Serbia for, among other things, also murdering their prime minister in 2003. Many people that don't know anything about this world will know the Serbian volunteer guard, Arkan Tigers, will know, for example, the picture on the left. If you're interested in what happened to the tiger, it's not a happy story. They forgot to vaccinate it, and then the cub died. It was basically given to them because his a friend was the director of the Belgrade Zoo. So they got the tiger, they didn't vaccinate it, and the tiger died. So perpetration of violence. Fighting war is not illegal. And so this is not, I'm not telling a story about kind of fighting soldiers between soldiers. Also, sadly, in certain circumstances, it is also not illegal to harm civilians. These circumstances are pretty narrow, but you know, there's cases in The Hague as well where a certain amount of civilian harm is accepted. And we can get into that, and I'm sure if there's lawyers in the room, they will know this as well. But the way many of these units harmed civilians were, you know, executing people that were unarmed, burning people's houses, rape, looting, beatings, arbitrary arrests, all kinds of things. Some units, especially the non-professional ones, were also engaged in really exceptionally cruel acts. For those of you that are more familiar with the story, for example, the Yellow Wasps, Žute ose, were known as perpetrators of sort of really exceptionally cruel attacks on civilians. Some units, as I already kind of alluded to, engaged in instrumental violence. They would come to a town, you know, do something for a couple of days, seize the town, and move on. And this violence was not necessarily made for an audience. It wasn't performed sort of so much in kind of public spaces. And some others were very much interested in expressive forms of violence. So they would do harm in ways that were visible and audible to other people. Of course, we can find cases that are kind of gray areas, but overall, there was a distinction between these two kinds of violence. If you're interested in this, for example, Leanne Fuji is an American scholar. She's also sadly late, but she wrote a really good book called Showtime, and it's about this expressive forms of violence and what the purpose of this violence is. And in some ways, it's to send a message. And in that respect, it can be also quite similar to sort of terrorism. You know, you harm people not necessarily only for the people that you harmed, but so that everyone else sees, and then they run away. And Hikmet Karčić wrote a really good book about this kind of collective traumatization, the purpose of which is to traumatize people so much that they never come back. And I think this is kind of relates to that argument as well. Perpetration of sexual violence, of course, is also something that has got, of course, a lot of attention and for good reason. And some of this violence was as well this idea that you would harm people, that the entire community would want to leave, and that you would break social ties in the community that you want to harm, basically. So, and again, and we can get into this in the Q&A, but again, there's differences between violence that you perpetrate against people that you know and violence that you perpetrate against people that you don't know. I, for example, know of examples from camps where people take advantage of the breakdown of the rule of law to beat the professor that flunked them in math, to rape the girl that never wanted to have sex with them in high school. It is not about the war. The breakdown of the rule of law is just a way for you to take revenge, a way for you to enact frustrations and resentments against people that you were jealous of, for example. So that's why in many towns around Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a lot of people here will know this, the first people to be targeted were people of standing, people that had money, people that had position, lawyers, judges, professors, and people in certain positions of power. This is an image that I'm sure will be known to you. This is a unit is called the Scorpions, and the guy, the rifle on the state was their commander. And this is a still from a video of the execution that we have of the only actually video of an execution that we have in the entire body of evidence at the ICTY that is really so explicit. And this is a still from that video, and I think some of you have also maybe read an article that I wrote about it. So before we move on to Ukraine, just a couple of things to remember. Not all paramilitaries are the same. Some can be professionalized, some can be non-professionalized, they can be centralized or decentralized. So we really need to take each and every one of them as a thing in themselves and study their structure and their purpose. States are very dynamic and diverse relationships with units, and these are often transactional. So there's something in it for both of them. States use these kinds of units to outsource violence and to kind of create plausible deniability. And they use this and they create this plausible deniability in very purposeful ways that you can see repeated from unit to unit, from place to place. This is sometimes not always, it doesn't always make people happy for me to say this, but not all members of all units are necessarily murderers and rapists. Many are, but also some are not. So I think there's also an important distinction there. If you study various kinds of units, it is often the case that there's one or two guys that drive the action forward. There's certain guys that follow. There's certain guys that follow kind of reluctantly because they don't want to be pressured by their peers. They don't want to be called a pussy and a coward. And they don't want to face the stigma in their own unit after. And there's guys that see what's about to happen and then they walk away. So there's also differences between how people behave in these situations. This idea of instrumental versus expressive violence, so that the units do different things for different reasons and for different purposes, sort of very public-facing violence, and some that is more just kind of driven by a certain goal, and then in a couple of days we're out of town and we're doing the same thing somewhere else. And finally, this idea that not all... there is no one thing that can really explain the perpetration of violence against civilians. I just want to talk for a little bit about Ukraine. Now, I've spent almost 20 years studying the former Yugoslavia. I have not spent 20 years studying Ukraine. So I do not claim to have the same level of knowledge and understanding, but I have followed the war in Ukraine since it started in 2014, and of course, very, very intensely since the 24th of February last year. I live in The Hague. This is, in some ways, maybe sadly, pretty much all that people talk about in The Hague. It completely sucks up all the oxygen then when it comes to war crimes trials in The Hague. This is, 10 years ago, everyone was talking about Syria. No one talks about that today. In The Hague, no one mentioned Syria. I haven't heard it in a year. So there's also a critique, I think, to fashionableness in certain ways. But I want to say a couple of things here. So in 2014, one thing that I think is comparable are what people call the little green men that showed up in Crimea in 2014 in uniforms with no insignia. And they were deployed for kind of intimidation and the display of force. Again, different kinds of units existed on both sides. I say sides like this because I'm a little bit uneasy to say, the Croatian side, Serbian side, the whatever side, Ukrainian. There's always more gray area than this, but for the purposes of simplicity, I'll leave it like this. The locals and the foreigners were acting together in these units, and the foreigners in Ukraine since 2014, it's very difficult to say with any certainty. And we also don't have a precise number for the former Yugoslavia either. These are all estimates. But the estimate is that there's about 17,000, what we would call foreign fighters, foreign volunteers in Ukraine, and most of them are Russians. Actually, a colleague of mine, his name is Kaspar Rajkavec, he wrote a book recently, it's called Foreign Fighters in Ukraine, with Routledge, so you can read it if you're interested. He has done a lot of similar work. He's interviewed people. So if you're interested in the foreign fighters in Ukraine, you can read his book. But some connections are, for example, that you can find certain guys veterans from the former Yugoslavia that went there. And there, for example, in the Donbass, there's certain veterans from the Croatian War, from the Croatian side that went to the Ukrainian side of the war. What is really fascinating, and I've looked into this a little bit, is that Croatians 100% of the time go to the Ukrainian side, and the Serbs 100% of the time, from what I saw, go to the Russian side. Maybe I'm wrong, but from what I've seen, it's super, super, super predictable. And I find that fascinating. There's almost a certain mirroring of the war here taking place there. Early recruitment in 2014 was much more ideologically driven, and many of these guys were kind of far-right kind of guys. And I would say that today is much less the case, because today both sides of the conflict are not really interested in having ideologically driven guys that are, for example, not very experienced, don't speak the local languages. I've heard one member of a unit in Ukraine say that sometimes these foreign volunteers are like a really heavy backpack. They don't speak the language. If they don't experience, they're like more trouble than it's worth. They're not very useful to you in a war. So by now, a lot of the people on the ground just really don't want a lot of these kinds of guys joining. In the last year, we've seen really the situation in Ukraine change dramatically. And I'm going to get to the Wagner Group in a minute to talk about how this changed. But really, there's, for example, one guy that was filmed in 1994 in Grbavica. His name is Zak Novakovic. I also talk about him in the book. He was filmed with the Šešeljevci unit in Grbavica. And he was also then found in Donbas, which I think where he remains. So you also see these parallels of guys who kind of move from one war to another. Now, to just very briefly say a couple of words about the Wagner Group. So the Wagner Group is in the media every day a billion times. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of myth. There's a lot of kind of murkiness about it. And this is, these kinds of units everywhere are really difficult to study. And I remember when I started my research, I was talking to some of the journalists in Belgrade that studied the guys in the former Yugoslavia in a lot of detail. His name is Dejan Anastasijević. He also died a couple of years ago. He was a good friend of mine, and he said to me early on in my PhD research, because I was thinking, who should I speak to about these units? And he said, those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. And I think this is very much the case. For example, I've been following the Stanišić and Simatović case for 20 years. Stanišić and Simatović don't speak. They never make statements. They never said a word. They say something like, yes, I understand the proceedings in the language that I understand, or I can hear the proceedings. And how are you feeling? I'm feeling well. They never make any statements. So there's a secrecy that is incorporated in these kinds of actors. So researching them is really, really difficult. But what we can say, I think, is that they were first very covert. They acted under the radar. They appeared in 2014. First, they were more like a professionalized sort of operation. And it was both a political tool and a military tool for the Russian state, and also very much enacting this idea of plausible deniability. However, everything changed last year. They went from a fairly small operation of a couple of thousand guys to people are projecting or sort of guessing, really, but guessing based on informed sources, is that their numbers have gone up to 40 or 50,000 because many of the numbers were inflated by people who were recruited from prisons in massive numbers to be used basically like cannon fodder in the East. And we've seen a lot of reporting about that lately. Importantly about Wagner, there is really no Wagner. Wagner doesn't exist formally. The laws in the Russian Federation don't allow it. They are really not even a paramilitary in the traditional sense. They're like a conglomerate, like an umbrella under which paramilitary units or armed guys operate alongside the middlemen between state security, between organized crime, between real and fake companies in different places in the world. So it's really, when you talk about Wagner, you're kind of, talking about this umbrella that is very diverse, and people have been researching them in places as diverse as, of course, Ukraine, but also Mali, Central African Republic, Venezuela, Syria. So they appeared in these different places, and they do different things in all of these places. There's also, and there's been some media reporting about this, that there's recruitment also in the region here. But from our best knowledge, this is not, we're not talking about any massive numbers. And as I also said, some of the 1990s veterans joined. So veterans from 1990s that will go there and then eventually found their way, if there were any good. Some of them found, for example, their path to be trainers in Wagner. And just briefly, I could talk about war crimes trials forever. This is really something that I think is the most fascinating thing in the world. But just a couple of very general points, and then we can get to it more in the Q&A in a couple of minutes. So in the aftermath of most instances of mass violence, the majority of perpetrators do not end up prosecuted and imprisoned. These numbers are always low. We know this very well here in the former Yugoslavia, and they're finding that out very quickly in Ukraine. The latest numbers that I've read is that the General Prosecutor's Office in Ukraine has 72,000 criminal complaints. So 72,000 potential cases of war crimes. We don't know if they are war crimes. We have to investigate, but there's 72,000 potential cases of war crimes. Never, ever, ever, ever will the vast majority of those things be investigated because there's no capacity for that. And this we know because there's a lot of these institutions in the last 30 years that were set up to prosecute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, ICTR, its sister court that dealt with Rwanda, ICC, the International Criminal Court, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. In Cambodia, prosecutions also take place, of course, in the domestic system, where I worked here at the Court of VIH, the prosecutor's office, but also in the Netherlands, where I live, France, Germany, Sweden, Ukraine. Ukraine is also now very much, I think they even finalized something like 7 or 8 trials by now of very low-level perpetrators. So perpetrators can be paramilitary members, but they're also military and civilian politicians, mayors, and Sarajevans will, of course, know this well, because the people that besieged them was the Bosnian Serb army. It was not the paramilitaries. A few more points on prosecution of crimes that relates to paramilitary specifically. So, as I already alluded to, there's much need for justice, criminal justice, but there's also other complementary mechanisms of transitional justice that can sort of help this process. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of these people never end up in jail. There is often a lack of political will, which translates into a lack of resources and a lack of expertise. And because I think fundamentally the judicial system, the way we have it, is designed for crime as an exception and not crime as a rule. So if you have 5 murders a day, the state can process that. If you have 500 murders a day, the state cannot deal with that. There's too many investigators needed, too many prosecutors, too many courtrooms, too much money. There's simply no capacity for that. So there's always discussions about how to handle that, and the Ukrainians are discovering that as we're speaking this evening. There's a difficulty also in investigating to the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high standard, which basically means that there is no other possible conclusion than that person X has done Y. It's not like, oh, well, it seems like they were doing it. That's not enough. You can't send someone to jail for 30 years because it kind of seems like they were involved, you know? So the standard is very high, and it's very difficult to prove to that standard. So it raises these questions of case selection and prioritization, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the story. We also have to come across difficulties of, for example, frailty of human memory. I've seen witnesses come to The Hague testify in different trials, and sometimes it's like 5 years pass in between. In one trial, they would say, the uniform was definitely blue. It was definitely blue. They pulled the testimony from 5 years ago. No, the uniform was actually green, you know? So sometimes these details really vary because human memory is such that, especially in traumatizing circumstances, when time passes, it's very difficult to remember these kinds of details. You know, if someone comes to your house in the middle of the night and drags you away somewhere or takes your family member, it's not like you're spending a lot of time analyzing the insignia on their shoulder, for example. And prosecutions often kind of end up with low-level perpetrators, direct perpetrators, and not high up individuals up the chain of command. Because this, what we call linkage evidence, is hard to obtain. So, for example, if someone is sitting across an international border, like Stanisic and Simatovic, they're sitting in a state that's a different state than here. They're not physically anywhere near many of the crimes. They have no formal relationship with any of these units. So the judges, are like, we're not really 100% sure about some of these things. So this linkage evidence to link someone to a crime that's like 500 kilometers away is really very difficult. So I, in some ways, have a lot of sympathy for people that are trying to prove this. So this ambiguity that we were talking about who units belong to, it's very difficult to establish beyond a reasonable doubt. And as I already talked about, this murkiness, this murky waters, that's on purpose to avoid accountability in the aftermath. The prosecutions are for lower level perpetrators because of these difficulties of proving these ties. A lot of the cases are also doomed because, the Bosnian Serb army had documents, a lot of documents. And in that regard, that was easier. There was clarity about how the chain of command worked. A lot of these kinds of units are not into bureaucracy, and for good reason. So some of this kind of documentary evidence can be challenging. Sometimes we rely on what we call insider witnesses. So these are basically people who move in the same circles, sometimes the same units, the same structures, who are able to provide evidence that otherwise we would never know. Because I've never seen a document they would say, go in this village, rape, murder, kill, and then stamp and sign. So a lot of the times it's about wink, wink, nod, nod, what needs to be done. And for this kind of stuff, you really need insiders. And it's difficult to rely on them because they, often come from the same social circles as the people that they're potentially testifying against. And they may have really very strong agendas of their own to testify. And you need them because witnesses that are survivors that have been abused themselves know only that much. Often they will not have any idea about who paid the unit, who commanded them. They won't, it's simply not accessible to them to have this kind of insight. So often you need these kinds of insiders to tell you things that other people will not know. So all of this makes it quite difficult to prosecute this kind of violence. And so just a couple of final remarks before we open it up for questions. Again, this idea that when they're not all the same, and there could be different units doing different things, perpetrating expressive versus instrumental violence. So violence that is kind of hidden or more in public view. About this dynamic and diverse relationships between the states and the units. And this outsourcing violence and plausible deniability, it, as I already said, it really works. I wait to be surprised by the Stanisic and Simatovic judgment that is expected this year, but I'm not holding my breath. So as long as that is the case, I think these units are going to be present and visible in conflicts around the world because states can achieve their territorial, demographic, political goals without, paying much a cost, I guess, or without being punished for it in the aftermath. Very few people are convicted, especially higher up. Where we are now with kind of war crimes trials in the former Yugoslavia, I think, and I stand to be corrected if there's disagreements about this, but I really think that the best days of war crimes trials are behind us. The ICTY is closed. The mechanism is, half empty. There's almost no one there anymore. From what I hear at the prosecutor's office here in the state court as well, and the reports that I've read, things have been slowing down. COVID, of course, didn't help. People are dying. Suspects are dying. Witnesses are dying. So things are not looking great when it comes to the future of war crimes prosecution. So accountability, especially for higher ups, remains a challenge very much in the former Yugoslavia, but very much also in Syria that has seen almost no prosecutions at all, and to Ukraine, which, it's very early still to tell. But sadly, it's not a story where justice wins in the end. And just a final note, if you're interested in the archives of the ICTY, and you have students that are interested in it, I've recently wrote an article. It's called Archives of Mass Violence. It's open access. It's in English, but you can access it. And it's a really kind of simple how to research ICTY archives kind of a piece. And if you ever have questions about any of it, I'm more than happy to help. My book that this talk was based on is going to be translated sometime this winter. The publisher is Snimak from Zagreb. So I hope it will find some readers here, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Iva. Hvala, Iva. Pitanja su vam mnoga ostala. Imamo nešto vremena da postavimo pitanja. Možete postaviti komentare. You guys, it's also possible, but let's first have this audience because they have this unique chance now. Dakle, izvolite slobodno na našem jeziku.
Ja prije svega da se zahvalim stvarno Ivi, radim neko istraživanje koje se zapravo bavi ovim našim ljudima koji su se priključili ukrajinskim ratovima. I prosto kad izašla vaša knjiga, to je, ja mislim, bila jedina onako sistemski urađena studija i zapravo neki materijal iz koje se može uopšte crpiti slične informacije. Onako, samo ukratko, mislim, mnogo pitanja imam, nekako ću se nekad sresti, nadam se, na priliku razgovaramo. Mene zanima na koji način se sada, sav taj materijal koji se prikazuje na društvenim medijima, jer čini se da sada te paravojne strukture, onako i pojedini likovi koji se učestvuju u tim strukturama, dosta slobodno oglašavaju na društvenim medijima i da se zapravo čitava ta konstrukcija i nasilja i tako dalje može pratiti online. Jel? Šta se dešava s tim materijalima, na koji način su oni tretirani na sudovima i posebno me zanima ta mogućnost koje sada velike korporacije, Facebook, na primjer, imaju da nekome ukinu account i samim tim nestane dokazni materijal.
Hoćete da prikupimo par pitanja, pa ili hoćete jedno po jedno, kako se vama čini najpametnije? Da budemo efikasniji.
Dobro večer svima. Ja sam Mustafa Dedović, magistar historije. Jako je zanimljivo večeras bilo slušati vas. Konkretno se bavim najviše istraživanjem posljednjeg rata. Nisam se toliko bavio pitanjima paravojnih formacija, ali eto nekako zanimljivo je bilo posmatrati iz ove perspektive. Samo da dodam malo da se i našalim, paradoksalno je posmatrati rat u Ukrajini kada Bošnjaci koji su primarno muslimani navijaju za ukrajinske pravoslavce, dok bosanski Srbi koji su generalno pravoslavci navijaju za čečenske muslimane. Interesantno je bilo i kako ste predstavili Wagner kao neki poseban koktel, tako sam barem ja razumio. I primijetio sam paralelu, na primjer, sa Vijetnamskim ratom, kada je američka vojska imala jednu posebnu jedinicu koja se zove McQueen SOG, koja je tako kršila zakone, prelazila Kambodžu i također su činili razne zločine, ali konkretno imam pitanje vezano za koji nekako historičar bježaju od toga. Da li postoji neki broj, ne samo paravojnih jedinica, nego učesnika paravojnih jedinica koji su činili zločine? Hvala.
Bravo, samo ću dva pitanja kratko. Prvo pitanje, da li se može povući ta neka paralela između ti uvjetno rečeno ofanzivni i defanzivni paramilitaries? Naprimjer, imamo tu priliku kako da vidimo u našem ratu, naprimjer, taj mirroring, pa je bilo, ne znam, crvene beretke, pa zelene beretke, pa ne znam, Arkanovi tigrovi, pa Jukini vukovi i tako neke stvari, čak se i na tom nekom nivou imena se kopiraju neke stvari. Da li, koja je, na primjer, strukturalna ta razlika između offensive i defensive, uvjetno rečeno, paramilitaries, i drugo pitanje, kako postižu tako veliku popularnost? Ne znam sad da li se bavite tim dijelom istraživanja. Na primjer, sociološki je interesantno da su škorpioni ili, na primjer, Arkanovi vukovi značajno viđeniji i popularniji nego, na primjer, strukturalna velika vojska Republike Srpske koja je bila imala veliku strukturu, hijerarhiju i ostale stvari, ili ne znam, armija BiH ili druge neke jedinice koje su onako strukturalizirane, a ove su izrazito popularne i prepoznate, to je globalno i privlače na kraju krajeva i dan danas neke stvari?
Može, evo ja sam zapisala, napravit ću, odnosno dat ću sve od sebe da odgovorim koliko mogu. Prvo ovo pitanje što se tiče društvenih mreža, na našem sudu to nije bila tema, jer 90-ih jednostavno to nije postojalo kao medij, no Međunarodni kazneni sud i velikim dijelom ljudi koji su istraživali rat u Siriji ima u Ženevi tijelo koje se zove Impartial Mechanism koje se bavi Sirijom i oni su potrošili silan trud i novce i dobili su čak i pomoć od velikih kompjuterskih IT kompaniju. Ja se ispričavam ako malo nespretno neke termine koristim, ja skoro nikad o ovom ne pričam na našem jeziku i ja sam odrasla u Zagrebu i to mi je materinji jezik, ali s ovim stvarima dosta nekad mi zna zaštekat, nekako nespretno nekad zvučim. Uglavnom, ja bih rekla možda negdje prije 10 godina, prije 15 godina se puno pažnje počelo posvećivati tim temama. Ja imam kolege u Nizozemskoj koji se upravo bave i sa pravnog aspekta, ali i s drugih aspekata, znači korištenjem dokaznog materijala s društvenih mreža. Čak ima jedno suđenje pred Međunarodnim kaznenim sudom koje je velikim dijelom i završeno temeljem dokaza sa društvenih mreža. Problem je volumen. Ja sam razgovarala sa kolegom koji se bavi Sirijom i on mi je rekao da kad bi uzeli sve klipove na YouTube-u koji dolaze iz rata u Siriji, da trajanje tog videa bi bilo 40 godina. Znači 40 godina video footage, za rat koji je 10 godina, znači sad nešto više, mada naravno sad nije istim intenzitetom, ali nema te organizacije, nema tog tužilaštva koje to može preraditi. Tako da se oni služe sad različitim tehnologijama i umjetnom inteligencijom da na neki način kroz to probaju proći i da vide šta je korisno i što nije. Slične se inicijative sad rade u Ukrajini isto tako gdje puno ljudi naravno ima kameru u džepu. Mi još moramo na pravi način vidjeti efekte toga. Jednostavno nismo imali puno suđenja gdje se to testiralo. Ali sad kako tehnologija ide dalje, postavlja se i pitanja fake videos i slične stvari, gdje kako tehnologija napreduje, mislim da će biti veliki izazov i sucima koji su često i stariji ljudi koji nisu super u tim, mislim daleko od toga da sad ako je starija osoba automatski digitalno nepismena, ali radi se nekad ljudima koji ne koriste oni TikTok, nemaju, mislim, razumijete. Tako da bit će, ja mislim, to sigurno problem u godinama koje dolaze. Ako hoćete poslije, mislim da ću vam vizitku i onda možemo se čuti, rado ću vam dati imena kolega koji se baš bave time, koji će moći puno kompetentnije o tome pričati nego ja. Možda isto samo da spomenem, promaklo mi je ranije, danas je Fond za humanitarno pravo izdao dosje o Arkanovcima, mislim 70-80 stranica, isto temeljem arhive Međunarodnog kaznenog suda. Naravno, isto jedan resurs koji nije na odmet, ako vas to zanima, da pače, oni su uvijek radili izuzetno ozbiljan posao. I ja vas zaista pozivam, ako vas ove teme zanimaju, da pročitate taj dosje. Što se tiče broj učesnika koji čine zločine, to je, mislim, broj učesnika uopće je ballpark, totalno procjena. Tako da, ako dubinski ne istražujete neki incident, vi ne možete kredibilno tvrditi da je osoba A počinila ili nije počinila neki zločin. Znači, ja se zaista ne bi usudila sad reći 5,000, nemam pojma. Tako da, to je nažalost jednostavno neprocjenjivo da govorimo za ljude koji nisu prošli kroz ozbiljne istraživanja. To se tiče ofanzivnih i defenzivnih paravojski. Ja tu konceptualizaciju ne koristim. Ja sam se znači bavila u jedinicama koje su nastupale u ime države Srbije u svojem istraživanju. Ja vjerujem da određene razlike postoje, ali kao ja se nadam ozbiljna znanstvenica, nije moje da se tu ko na placu gađam. Tako da, budući da to nije konceptualizacija koju ja koristim, ne bi nagađala o tim, pošto ja se recimo nikad nisam bavila zelenim beretkama i stvarno mi je teško sad napamet lupat. No, moja je misija u životu, ako mogu ikako pomoći, da se nas što više ovim stvarima bavi, pa onda ne moram ja sve te članke pisati. I moj drug Hikmet Karčić isto tako se bavi sličnim materijalom. Znači, ja se stvarno nadam da će studenti preuzeti na sebe i da koriste taj materijal, pa da onda članaka postoji više. Ja ću prva pročitati kad izađe sličan tekst. I još ovo o popularnosti je izuzetno zanimljiva tema. Postojali su stripovi o kninđama o toj jedinici jednoj na početku rata. Meni je potpuno fascinantno da je Legija, tip koji je u zatvoru već 15 godina, i dalje dan danas na naslovnim stranicama tabloida odaje jučer od zatvor. Ta neka fascinacija tim undergroundom, mislim da ima veze djelomično sa tim nekim feelingom opasnog dečka sa beogradskog asfalta. Mislim da je to dio objašnjenja. Naša ideja muškosti, ono što bi zvali masculinity, ta obsesija sa tim šta izgleda bit, kako izgleda pravi jedan frajer, kako bi mi rekli u Zagrebu. Znači, jedan pravi muškarac je to Legija, recimo. Tako da je to meni isto apsolutno fascinantno. Kolegica jedna je prije dosta godina napisala, Saša Milišević se ona zove, u Americi. Ako vas zanima, pošaljite mi maila, ću vam poslati njen članak. Ona se upravo bavila tom tematikom te muškosti i što je to što ljude tako fascinira u vezi s tim tipovima.
Ida Šehović, umjetnica, pa iz svoje perspektive mi zanima par stvari. Možete li reći da li ste se susreli sa, u stvari, da li možete išta reći kako se koristi, na koji način se koristila umjetnost u ove svrhe? To me malo zanima. Tokom vremena kad su ove paravojne jedinice aktivne, ali i poslije, kako to znači ostaje traga. A drugo me isto, radoznala sam da li imate ikakvih informacija šta se dešava sa tim ljudima mimo njihovog učešća u ovim paravojnim jedinicama. Znači, da li su to ljudi koji imaju porodice i onda se vraćaju, imaju normalan život? To me zanima, da li je to, eto, ako možete o tome nešto više reći. Hvala.
Dobro večer. Hvala puno na prilici da postavim pitanje. Moje ime je Dalibor Tanić, ja sam novinar i aktivista i sada postavljam pitanje iz te neke svoje novinarske perspektive. Pre nekih 5 ili 6, možda više godina sam se kroz istraživanje prvi put susreo sa bataljonom Azov u Ukrajini. Dakle, to je bataljon za ljude koji možda prvi put čuju za njih. Dakle, to je sve one karakteristike koje ste nabrojali. Dakle, sva obeležja imaju, dakle, jedne paramilitarne formacije. Ono što je meni bilo jako problematično u svemu tome je što su oni otvoreno, dakle, baštinili neonacizam. I vrlo su otvoreno uz blagoslov, kako ste objasnili, čistili. Nemam drugu reč, ali čistili su romska naselja, bukvalno su bili milicija ulična koja je čistila apsolutno sve od nečega što nije po mjeri prihvatljivo. Tako je. U jednom momentu, dakle, početkom invazije na Ukrajinu, dakle, voleo bih da prosto dekonstruišemo, ako smemo potrebiti reč, hipokriziju ne Evropske unije samo, nego čitave evropske zajednice. Dakle, u jednom momentu se dešava da je Azov bataljon stub odbrane Ukrajine od invazije Rusije. Pa bih taj moment samo, dakle, tu transformaciju Azov bataljona od nekog, mislim da je čak i bio na listi FBI-a, čak i od Evropske unije su bili proglašeni terorističkom organizacijom ili tako nešto, odjedanput su postali, dakle, najveći heroji odbrane. Hvala.
Dobro večer. Ja. Moje ime je Andrij Lipa, ja sam možda neki mirror opposite ovo, kako ste vi sebe predstavili, vi se teoretičar koji je u pravnim krugovima, ja sam pravnik koji se onako drogira historijom rekreativno. Pa ne znam da vi prava adresa što ovo postaviti, to više istorijsko pitanje, ne znam da li se proučavate toliko duboko. Ove paravojne formacije što ste ih naveli, kroz moje rekreativno čitanje istorije i toga, sam se susretao sa pojmovima, pogotovo srednjovjekovnim, onim mercenary, sword for hire. Da li je po neke prirodne evolucija tih formacija koje su uvijek bile prisutne u regularnim vojskama? Ili je ovo nešto drugačije, neki psihološki rad? Sad ne znam da li ste vi uopšte adresa da odgovori na ovo, ali hvala.
na ovom predavanju. Zaista zanimljivo i godinama pratim tvoj rad. Ono što bih nekako voljela, ako je moguće, i doticala se ti u svom radu toga, ali što mislim da je jako važno kada govorimo o ovim paravojnim formacijama, većina njih, i konkretno mogu govoriti o kapetanu Draganu, o Arkanu, o mnogim drugim, formirale su ih obavještajne službe. Problem suđenja Stanišiću i Stojmatoviću jesu što su oni obavještajci koji su ne samo srbijanski obavještajci, nego su povezani sa međunarodnim obavještajnim službama. Da li je to takav slučaj i sada, recimo, u Ukrajini i uopće ako možete malo govoriti o to, jer to su stvari ljudi, ove paravojne formacije su najčešće bili ljudi koji su radili direktno i to i dokumenti iz Haga pokazuju i postoje liste koji govori da su oni bili na njihovim platnim spiskovima, naročito je to slučaj sa ovim koji ste vi ovdje spominjali, pa i sa Legijom koji je poslije sarađivao i nakon Miloševića, u krajnjem slučaju i sa Đinđićevim ljudima je sarađivao i sa nekim drugim, pa su, šta mi je zanimljiva ta veza sa obavještajnim službama i paravojnim formacijama.
Ajmo sad ova 4 pa ćemo.
Ovo su sve zaista sjajna pitanja i voljela bi da imam puno više vremena i da možemo sjeti na kave i pričati o ovome satima, no evo sad moramo biti efikasni. Što se tiče umjetnosti, ja se nažalost time nikad nisam bavila, tako da sva moja saznanja su onak epizodna sa društvenih mreža i sa izložbi sa koje sam imala uvjetno rečeno sreće i prilike posjetiti. Znano naravno za neke projekte, neki su naravno jako vidljivi, recimo Ko vadi Saida, Jasmila Žbanić je film koji je baziran na haškim dokumentima i na haškim dokazima na način da su dijelovi dijaloga riječ po riječ vađeni iz dokaznog materijala. Tako da su to neke tako high profile stvari. Nešto uvjetno rečeno drugačije su recimo bila izložba u Beogradu Mladićevih dnevnika koji su bili postavljani u galeriji kao na neki način umjetnički artefakt o kojem se na taj način razgovaralo. Puno pažnje se posljednjih godina okrenulo tom nekom prostoru umjetnosti zato što se sve više shvaća da neke ranije ambicije koje smo imali sad će nas međunarodni sudovi pomirit, neće. Tako da se puno više pažnje posvećuje umjetnosti, zato što se to vidi kao taj nekakav prostor gdje postoji mogućnost propitivanja dijaloga, susreta i svega toga. Imam kolege koji su radili na Kingsu projekt koji je na neki način mapirao neke od tih stvari i vama ću isto ponuditi ako vas interesira, vrlo rado ću vas spojiti s tim ljudima. Kolegica Rachel Kerr sa Kingsa je radila baš projekt koji se zove Arts and Reconciliation i oni su se bavili djelomično znači i dokaznim materijalom i kako je on korišten u umjetnosti. Što se tiče Azova, apsolutno ste u pravu. Oni, ako se ne varam, sad i dio nacionalne garde, znači oni su usisani u državu na isti način na koji su usisani u državu bili jedinice za specijalne operacije. I to je zapravo sudbina vrlo često mnogih tih jedinica, da u nekom trenutku oni postanu formalno dio države. U apsolutnom ste isto tako pravu kad je u pitanju, to su zaista ljudi, mnogi su bili zaista ono što bi zvali far right, znači ekstremna desnica i kolega, kanadski novinar Michael Colborn je napisao knjigu o Azovu i ovaj drugi kolega koji je u Oslu, Kaspar Rekovek, je napisao tu knjigu o strancima u Ukrajini. I oni se obojica bave Azovom dosta detaljno i intervjuirali su te ljude i sve to skupa. Ja se nisam na tom nivou njima bavila, ali ono što je moj dojam je da se od tih prvih dana do danas dosta stvari ipak izmijenilo, da su oni uvidjeli da im ta full-on obvious nacistička spika ne radi nikakve usluge i da su oni dio svojih redova od toga počistili. To sam ja od ljudi koji se bave njima u detalje čula. I sad to ne znači da su oni danas cvijeće i leptirići, ali da to nije više isti onaj Azov koji je bio prije 7-8 godina. Tako da ja vjerujem da i tu postoji nekakav prostor za promjenu, ali navodno neki ljudi koji su došli kasnije su rekli, gle, mi nigdje nećemo, niko se neće s nama otvoreno družiti, budemo li mi izgledali tako kao što izgledamo. Tako da ja ne mogu tvrditi o njihovom članstvu kakvi su oni sve to skupa, ali navodno su se barem djelomično očistili. Ali zaista vam preporučam knjige tih dvojica kolega, oni su se time bavili u dubinu. Što se tiče paravojski historijski, ja samo preporučam knjige drugih ljudi. Dimitar Tasić je napisao knjigu, Oxford je izdao, mislim, prije 2 godine i to je historijski pregled paravojski na Balkanu. On gleda i Albaniju i Makedoniju i te neke šire geografske i vremenske periode, tako da vas ja upućujem na njega. Ono što treba reći o plaćenicima je formalno gledano imaju dvije karakteristike koje ih čine plaćenicima. Ako ste vi plaćenik, to znači da vi niste lokalno povezan sa tim konfliktom. Znači, ko da ja idem ratovati u Mongoliju. Znači, ja tamo nemam familiju, nikad tamo nisam živjela, šta ja tamo radim. I druga stvar, ako sam došla tamo zbog novca, ako je moja plaća bitno viša od plaće nekoga ko je sa mnom usporediv po rangu, to su 2 stvari koje te čine plaćenikom. U nekom formalnijem smislu i mislim da tu apsolutno ništa nije novo u 21. stoljeću, to je više manje sve viđeno, no kako se razvija tehnologija, kako se razvijaju potrebe država, one na taj način prilagođavaju te fenomene potrebama. I sad samo za kraj ovo što je Nidžara rekla, mislim, apsolutno si u pravu, samo da preporučim, evo, kad smo već tu, Rolling Stoneov članak o Srđanu Goluboviću na kojem ste vi radili, koji je zaista izuzetan projekt i sve vas pozivam da ga pogledate. Mislim da se zove The DJ and the War Crimes i stvarno je sjajan i vi ste tu citirali platne spiskove, koji znači govore o tome gdje su ti ljudi bili i ko ih je plaćao i tu znači je sasvim jasno da su tu obavještajci u igri i tu ista stvar postoji i za Wagner. Mislim da je njihov početak upravo iz tih obavještajnih krugova, to nisu ljudi poput nas. To se tiče veza sa međunarodnim obavještajnim krugovima, ja mislim pola dokaza iz stanišća Sasimatovića je zaštićeno. Mi pojma nemamo šta je u tom suđenju. I nemamo pojma hoće li to ikad ko pusti vani da se gleda ili ne pusti. Tako da dio toga je malo onako spekulativan. Tako da vidjet ćemo, ja bih voljela da se mi svi zajedno borimo za to da ta dokumentacija do mjere do koje je moguće, a ne može se sve i meni je to jasno, ali do mjere do koje je to moguće da se to pusti u javnost, jer to je dokumentacija naša ko što je, mislim, i mi bismo morali biti u mogućnosti to gledati i koristiti.
Hvala. Također na iscrpnim odgovorima koji su stvarno, mogli bismo još dalje, ali stvarno su proširili i produbili ovu temu i da se zahvalim publici na sudjelovanju. Hvala vam lijepo i ugodno večer. Doviđenja.